Elize Kruger, an economist from Carpe Diem, joins me now. Elize, a very good afternoon to you. Just explain to our viewers and us in very simple terms what it means, that 7.4% figure.
Yes, CPI at 7.4% on an annual basis basically tells us that the basket of products that an average South African is using is 7.4% higher in terms of average price compared to last year in June. So it's an annual comparison.
All right. And so how is the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee likely to interpret that higher than expected inflation figure for June? And do we then expect to see quite an aggressive rate hike as a result?
Yes, I'm afraid that we've had 2 consecutive months now of higher than expected CPI outcomes. Since the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee met in May, we've had 2 more prints that came out higher than expected. So I do think that the Reserve Bank's own CPI forecasts are lagging on the current developments, the current actual outcomes, and that they will have to revise their own view on CPI quite a bit higher. To give you a feel for that extent of revision that could be coming through, they expected headline CPI to be on average 5.9% in 2022, but following the last 2 months and today's one in particular, I think we're going to be much closer to 7% on average for this year for headline CPI. And I do believe the bank will have to up their forecast by at least, say, 0.6 percentage points to the region of about 6.5%. So in that regard, I do think they're going to be perhaps really negative about the outcome, and I do believe they will hike rates further. I've got penciled in, like the consensus suggests, a 50 basis point hike when they finish their meeting this week. But I think today's number, and in the light of what's happening globally, we are seeing more and more boldness amongst global central banks, hiking by more than expected, hiking by bigger margins. I think there is a chance that the Reserve Bank might decide to hike maybe 75 basis points compared to the general forecast of 50 basis points.
Elize, what does high inflation and high interest rate hikes do to our prospects for economic growth and economic recovery?
Indeed, both of those are quite negative. So the higher inflation rate erodes the purchasing power of households, purchasing power of any rand you've got in your pocket, i.e. you'll be able to buy less products with the money in your pocket. So from that point of view, it places consumer spending under pressure. It also then economic growth. And if you add to that high interest rates, so the cost of credit becomes higher and higher. So every loan that you need to repay will be progressively more money out of your pocket each month.
Mm-hmm. And so how does this data and what you've spoken about now speak to the financial health of consumers who are already beleaguered by all these increases, and also, of course, our very high unemployment rate as well?
Indeed, this is quite negative news, especially given that both food and fuel prices, that are the 2 items that's the biggest in terms of weighting of the low-income group in South Africa, both of those are rising at significant numbers, way above the average inflation even. We're looking at food inflation now sitting at 9%. Your public transport inflation is around 14%. And your overall fuel price inflation is around 45%. So indeed, it's hard times for everybody in South Africa, and in particular the low-income group.
Mm-hmm. And how long can we expect these hard times to last, given what we know?
Well, let me say, I think we have one more really bad month coming up, and that's the month of July, given that we had another round of hefty fuel price increases in July. Thereafter, the tiny bit of good news is that we do expect fuel price drops for August. The drops will not be as big as the latest increases, but in the order of around R1.10 to R1.60 per litre, we could see sliced off from petrol and diesel prices if the current scenario in terms of oil and rand prevail for the rest of the month. So I do believe that July's headline CPI number of about 7.8, so it's quite high, but that will be the upper turning point of the current consumer price inflation cycle. So from there onwards, we could start to see inflation moderating towards year end. And then hopefully if we can see some alleviation of global factors, for instance, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and it's also impacting heavily on the oil price. If we could see some alleviation, that would be an extra bonus. But just based on current projections, I do see that we'll have a moderating effect from July towards the end of the year, although at quite a high level. So we'll still have an average inflation rate for this year in the order of about 6.9% in my calculations.
Elize Kruger, an economist from Carpe, Diem, thanks so much for your time and insight on SABC News this afternoon, just discussing that 7.4% CPI figure that we saw coming out a little bit earlier on.